Some killers chase money, others revenge. But then, there are those who kill because they believe they must. This is not about cruelty. It's about broken minds. In today's episode, we examine 3 chilling cases where the killer was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and their reasons were as terrifying as the acts themselves. Case 1. Richard Chase. The Vampire of Sacramento. Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23, 1950 in Santa Clara County, California. By all outward appearances, he had a typical middle-class upbringing. His father worked hard and enforced discipline. His mother was attentive, though later described as emotionally distant. There were no early signs that the boy would one day become one of the most terrifying killers in American history. But not everything was as normal as it seemed. Even as a child, Richard exhibited troubling behaviors. He wet the bed long past the age when most children stop. He tortured small animals. He would later admit to setting fires. These 3 traits form what psychiatrists often refer to as the McDonald triad, a cluster of behaviors sometimes associated with future violent tendencies. But in the 1950s and 60s, these were not well-understood warning signs. In his teenage years, Richard began showing deeper psychological problems. He became convinced that his heart would stop beating and that his blood was turning to powder. He thought his skull was changing shape and that his stomach was missing. He told people he could feel his organs shifting inside his body. These delusions were not just idle thoughts. He believed them with absolute certainty. Despite his deteriorating mental state, Richard managed to graduate from high school and even enrolled in college. But he was unable to maintain focus, and his behavior became increasingly bizarre. He began abusing alcohol and drugs, particularly LSD, and fell into isolation. Friends described him as paranoid, withdrawn, and often incoherent. In 1973, at the age of 23, Richard was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. It was there that his behavior became more openly alarming. He would smear blood from birds on his body, believing it would absorb through his skin and replenish his own blood. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. The doctors prescribed antipsychotic medication, and for a time, Richard improved. But in 1976, after less than a year in treatment, he was deemed stable and released into his mother's care. That decision would prove catastrophic. Richard stopped taking his medication shortly after returning home. His delusions returned stronger and more erratic than before. He believed his blood was evaporating. He became obsessed with the idea that someone was poisoning him. He began capturing and killing animals, drinking their blood, and blending their organs into a grotesque paste that he would eat raw. His mother, still under the belief that institutionalization had been too harsh, did not force him back into care. Instead, she helped him move into his own apartment in Sacramento. There, in a dingy one-bedroom unit, Richard Chase unraveled completely. He began ordering rabbits from pet stores and disemboweling them in his kitchen. He drank their blood. He sometimes injected it directly into his veins, believing it would prevent his internal organs from melting. Neighbors complained of foul smells, but police never intervened. By the end of 1977, Chase had escalated from animals to humans. His first known murder occurred on December 29, 1977. His victim was 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin, a man he had never met. Griffin was helping his wife bring groceries into their home when Chase drove by, rolled down his window, and shot him twice in the chest with a .22 caliber handgun. It was a test cold, random, and senseless. The murder shocked Sacramento, but there were no leads. Chase, meanwhile, was emboldened. He believed the act had worked, that his blood felt stronger, that he could now survive. 17 days later, on January 11, 1978, Chase attempted to enter the home of a woman, but her doors were locked. He walked away. Later, he would tell investigators that he saw locked doors as a sign he wasn't welcome. But an unlocked door was an invitation. That detail, eerie in its simplicity, would become one of the most chilling aspects of his pattern. 3 days later, on January 15th, he found an unlocked door. Teresa Mullin was 3 months pregnant when Richard Chase entered her home. Her husband was at work. She was alone. What happened inside defies understanding, and yet the details matter not for sensationalism, but to comprehend the depth of Chase's illness. He shot Teresa 3 times, killing her instantly. He then dragged her body into a bedroom, mutilated her with a knife, and performed acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. He drank her blood. He used a yogurt container as a makeshift cup. He removed several organs and smeared blood on the walls. When her husband returned home later that day, he found a scene of unimaginable horror. Police were stunned. There were no signs of robbery, no clear motive, just chaos. The media didn't release many details at the time, but inside law enforcement circles, panic was spreading. Sacramento had seen murder, but not like this. And it wasn't over. On January 23rd, just over a week later, Chase struck again, this time with greater ferocity. He entered the home of Evelyn Mayroth, a 38-year-old woman who was babysitting her 22-month-old nephew, David. Also in the house were Evelyn's 6-year-old son, Jason, and a family friend named Dan Meredith. What Chase did in that house cannot be summarized easily. It was a bloodbath. He shot and killed Dan in the hallway. He shot Jason in the head. He killed the baby in his crib. He mutilated Evelyn's body with a knife, drained her blood, and committed acts so depraved they were never fully detailed in public records. He collected internal organs in a bucket. When a friend arrived for a scheduled visit, he knocked on the door and saw movement inside. Sensing danger, he called police. Chase had already fled, but not before taking David's body with him. It was this act that would lead to his downfall. Police launched a manhunt. They recovered fingerprints, ballistic matches, and most importantly, tire tracks near the scene that led to Chase's apartment. When officers arrived at his residence, they found the walls, ceiling, and floor stained with blood. The refrigerator contained human remains, along with several organs wrapped in tin foil. There were animal parts mixed in with the human ones. A blender crusted in dried blood sat on the counter. Richard Chase was arrested without resistance. In interviews, he was calm, matter of fact. He admitted to the murders. He described them not as crimes, but as necessary. He believed Nazis were poisoning him through soap, that UFOs were monitoring his thoughts, that he needed fresh blood to survive. He showed no remorse. At trial, his defense team presented a clear diagnosis: paranoid schizophrenia, extreme delusions, complete disconnection from reality. But prosecutors argued that Chase knew right from wrong, that he fled the scene, hid evidence, and took deliberate actions. The jury agreed. He was found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison. But Richard Chase never made it to the execution chamber. On December 26, 1980, he was found dead in his cell. He had overdosed on the stockpile of antidepressants he had been hoarding for weeks. Even in death, there were no final answers, no clarity, just a quiet end to a loud nightmare. Richard Chase remains a symbol of the worst-case scenario, when mental illness left untreated spirals into something violent and irreversible. His case would later be used in discussions about psychiatric care, involuntary treatment, and the balance between civil rights and public safety. He didn't kill for money. He didn't kill out of anger. He killed because his mind convinced him that blood was the only thing keeping him alive. And no one stopped him until it was far too late. Case 2. Andrea Yates. The Tragedy of a Mother's Mind. June 20th, 2001. A quiet house in a Houston suburb. 5 children. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary begin their morning routine. Their father has left for work. Their mother is drawing a bath. It should have been another ordinary day. But within 1 hour, the youngest would be floating in still water, and the rest would follow one by one without screams, without warning. Andrea Yates didn't look like someone who would commit unthinkable acts. To neighbors, she was shy but polite. A full-time mother of 5 dedicated to homeschooling her children and supporting her husband Rusty. To acquaintances, she was devout, deeply religious, quiet, and intelligent. She had once been a nurse. She spoke in soft tones. She avoided conflict. But inside her mind, something was breaking, and it had been breaking for years. Andrea Pia Kennedy was born in 1964, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class family. She was a star student class valedictorian captain of the swim team. She went on to earn a nursing degree and worked at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. For most of her young life, she showed no obvious signs of instability. That changed in her early 20s. Andrea began experiencing deep bouts of depression, accompanied by intrusive religious thoughts. But nothing emerged strongly until after marriage. She met Rusty Yates in 1989. The two bonded over shared religious values and married soon after. Rusty, an engineer at NASA, was intelligent and ambitious. He also followed the teachings of a self-proclaimed preacher named Michael Woroniecki, whose philosophy emphasized female obedience sin and the importance of having many children. Soon, Andrea was pregnant. Over the next 7 years, she gave birth to 5 children in rapid succession. The family chose a radically minimalist lifestyle, living for a time in a converted bus without running water or space for privacy. Rusty worked long hours. Andrea was often isolated, sleep-deprived, overwhelmed. After the birth of their 4th child, Luke, Andrea's mind shattered. She was hospitalized twice in 1999. She had attempted suicide. She was placed on antipsychotic medication and diagnosed with postpartum psychosis, a rare but serious condition that can cause delusions, hallucinations, and disconnection from reality. Doctors gave clear warnings. If Andrea had another child, the risk of relapse would be catastrophic. But in 2000, she became pregnant again. After Mary was born, Andrea began slipping. She stopped speaking for long periods. She refused to eat. She would stare at the walls for hours. She believed cartoons on television were speaking directly to her. She began reading the Bible obsessively, scribbling notes about sin and salvation. And then she began to believe something terrifying, that her children were being corrupted by her own inadequacy, that Satan had entered their lives, that she had failed as a mother, and that God had turned his back. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, Andrea waited for Rusty to leave for work. Her mother-in-law, who usually helped watch the children, was scheduled to arrive an hour later. Andrea knew she had a window. She filled the bathtub. She began with the youngest. 6-month-old Mary was drowned first, then Paul, then Luke, then John. She laid each of them gently on the bed, wrapped in a blanket. Then came Noah, the oldest, at 7. He ran when he saw what was happening, but Andrea caught him. He was the only one found still in the water when police arrived. She then called 911, not in panic, not in confusion, calmly, clearly. "I just killed my kids," she said. When officers arrived, Andrea led them through the house without resistance. There was no blood, no mess, no chaos, just silence. 5 small bodies, clean covered, peaceful. It looked like nap time. But what lay beneath was something much darker. Andrea explained her reasoning. She believed she had failed as a mother, that Satan was using her children to destroy the world, that if she didn't act, they would grow up, become corrupted, and burn in hell. She believed by taking their lives now before they reached the age of accountability, she was saving their souls. To the public, it sounded monstrous. To psychiatrists, it was textbook psychosis. The trial of Andrea Yates would become one of the most controversial court cases in modern American history. The prosecution argued premeditation. She waited until her husband left. She locked the dog away so it wouldn't interfere. She called 911. She admitted what she did. To them, this was deliberate murder. The defense presented a different story. Andrea had lost touch with reality. She did not see death. She saw salvation. They brought in expert witnesses who described her condition in clinical detail: auditory hallucinations, religious delusions. She believed television programs were mocking her. She believed the cartoon characters on the children's VHS tapes were warning her of damnation. She had previously filled a bathtub during a psychotic episode months earlier, but had stopped herself. This time the voices were louder. In a shocking outcome, Andrea Yates was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But that verdict would not last. 2 years later, the case was reopened. New evidence revealed that a prosecution psychiatrist had made false claims, specifically that Andrea had seen an episode of Law and Order that never existed, where a woman drowned her children and was acquitted by reason of insanity. That claim had influenced the jury. In 2006, Andrea Yates was retried. This time, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a high-security mental health facility. Today, Andrea lives in a state hospital near Houston. She rarely speaks to the public. She is reported to be lucid, cooperative, and compliant with treatment. She paints. She reads. She attends therapy. She does not ask for freedom. Rusty Yates, who once stood by her, later divorced and started a new life. He has said publicly that Andrea was not evil, that what happened was the result of untreated mental illness and a system that failed to act on warning signs. Many agree. Andrea's case sparked national debates on mental health postpartum psychosis, the role of religion in psychiatry, and the criminal justice system's ability to fairly evaluate mental illness. It changed the way doctors, lawyers, and even lawmakers viewed maternal mental health. But for many, the image that lingers is simpler: a bathtub, 5 towels, and a woman who thought she was doing the right thing by ending everything. Andrea Yates didn't hate her children. She didn't want revenge. She wanted to save them from something only she could see. In her mind, she was not killing. She was rescuing. She didn't smile. She didn't weep. She just waited for someone to take her away, because to her the act was already done. The judgment had already happened. And as she sat in that patrol car, the question that echoed through a nation wasn't why it was. How did no one stop her? Case 3. Herbert Mullin, the earthquake preventer. February 13th, 1973. A California courtroom sat in tense silence as a man in a faded prison jumpsuit calmly explained why he had killed 13 people. He didn't speak with rage. He didn't cry. Instead, Herbert Mullin looked directly at the judge and said, "If I hadn't done it, there would have been an earthquake." It wasn't a metaphor. He meant it literally. Herbert William Mullin was born on April 18, 1947 in Salinas, California. The second child in a middle-class Catholic family, he was described as a quiet and polite boy. His father, a World War II veteran, believed in discipline and structure and instilled in his son a sense of duty and responsibility. Herbert excelled academically. He was popular in high school, voted most likely to succeed by his classmates. But after graduation, something began to change. When a close friend died suddenly in a car accident, something inside Herbert snapped. He became withdrawn, detached, and increasingly obsessed with death. He began experimenting with drugs, LSD, and marijuana, but his real spiral came from within. He began to hear voices. He developed paranoid beliefs. He thought people could read his thoughts. He believed the government was watching him. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and hospitalized multiple times. He refused to take medication. His parents tried to help but couldn't reach him. By his mid-20s, Herbert had become fully consumed by delusion. And in his mind, California's safety was now in his hands. Herbert believed that natural disasters, particularly earthquakes, were the result of mankind failing to provide enough human sacrifice to the earth. He believed that every major earthquake was preceded by war. The deaths of soldiers, he thought, acted as offerings to stabilize tectonic forces. But now that there was no war, it was up to him. He believed he had to kill people, not because he wanted to, because the earth demanded it. So he began. His first victim was Lawrence White, a homeless man. On October 13, 1972, Mullin approached White on the side of the road and beat him to death with a baseball bat. He left the body in plain sight. There was no attempt to flee, no cover-up. Days later, he killed a 24-year-old hitchhiker named Mary Guilfoyle. He picked her up in his car, stabbed her to death, dismembered her body, and scattered her remains in the woods. His third victim was a priest, Father Henry Tomei. Mullin walked into the confessional booth at St. Mary's Church in Los Gatos. The priest welcomed him in. Mullin closed the curtain. Moments later, Father Tomei was dead, stabbed multiple times through the screen. It was only the beginning. Over the next few months, Herbert Mullin would go on a spree of calculated chaos. Each murder followed a twisted logic. Each victim was in his mind, selected by fate. He shot a family of 4, Jim Gianera, his wife, and 2 young guests, believing they were spreading evil energy. He murdered his former drug dealer, accusing him of contaminating his thoughts. He entered a cabin in the forest and killed 4 teenage boys who were camping, claiming they gave him telepathic permission to end their lives. He once carved a message into the wall of a crime scene warning. "I had to do this. You will understand soon." What made it more terrifying was how calm he seemed. He didn't flee the area. He didn't hide the bodies. To him, these weren't crimes. They were sacrifices. And with every killing, he believed he was holding back an apocalypse. Police began to connect the murders. Ballistics linked the bullets. The randomness made it hard to trace, but there was one constant: Herbert always stayed near Santa Cruz. On February 13, 1973, he was finally arrested after trying to enter a stranger's home. The man fought him off and called police. When officers searched Herbert's car, they found a .22 caliber pistol, blood-stained clothes, and a map with X marks. When they questioned him, he confessed to everything. At trial, Herbert's attorneys pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Psychiatrists described his delusions in vivid detail. He believed earthquakes would erupt beneath him unless he balanced the Earth's spiritual weight with human death. He told the jury he had received permission from the victims. He claimed they sent him messages begging to be chosen. The prosecution argued that Herbert knew what he was doing, that he had hidden evidence, that he had planned the killings, that he had changed weapons and locations to avoid detection. The jury agreed in part. Herbert Mullin was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 9 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was eligible for parole multiple times, but was denied at every hearing. He died in prison in August 2022. Herbert's story is often overshadowed by another serial killer who operated in the same area at the same time, Edmund Kemper. But unlike Kemper, who killed for control, or Chase, who killed for blood, Herbert Mullin killed for belief. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He truly believed he was saving lives. 13 people died, and not once did he hesitate. Because the voices were clear, because the ground was restless, because in his broken mind, it made sense. 3 killers, 3 fractured minds. They didn't seek profit or revenge. They believed they had no choice. If stories like this make you think twice, subscribe to Roadside Tales, where true crime meets quiet horror.